Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सरी का दिलदारान
आखर हमार मेल सन आखर हमार जोड़
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kaina siam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati kisale.
Grouthining yaukrai.
Shabda setu hon.
शब्दां दी सान।
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer Sanjoy Roy, and all of us at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you back for another episode of Jaipur Literature Festival's Words Are Bridges. Through this series, we are building bridges between communities, bringing to life the potential of human relationships, and highlighting the treasure languages have gifted literature. Our session today is Impostures, Michael Cooperson and Kevin Blankinship in conversation. Academic and author Michael Cooperson's Impostures is an English translation of Arab poet and scholar Al-Ḥarīrī's Maqāmāt, which follows the roguish Abū Zayd al-Sarūjī in his adventures around the medieval Middle East. Following the episodic, satiric, and critical writing style within the original, Cooperson matches the Arabic wordplay with an English narrative of his own by absorbing the distinctive styles of authors such as Chaucer, Mark Twain, and others. Cooperson is a professor of Arabic in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. He has also translated the life of Ibn Hanbal by Ibn al-Jawzi and the author and his doubles by Abdul Fattah Kiluto. Kevin Blankinship is a literary critic, poet, and translator, and an assistant professor of Arabic at Brigham Young University. Together, they evaluate the adventures and linguistic acrobatics that Impostures brings to the forefront. Michael Cooperson teaches Arabic at the University of California. His translation of Ibn al-Jawzi's Virtues of the Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal received the Sheikh Hamad Prize for Translation and International Understanding. His most recent publication is Impostures, an English translation of the Maqāmāt of Al-Ḥarīrī. Kevin Blankinship is currently writing a book about the blind author Al-Ḥarīrī and the world rejection in classical Arabic poetry. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and more. Before we move on to our session, we request you all to please follow our handles JLF Lit Fest on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram to get notified on any upcoming session. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF, and on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest. Please do share your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. We now present Impostures, Michael Cooperson and Kevin Blankinship in conversation.
I'd like to say thank you to the Jaipur Literature Festival, to Namita Gokhale and Kritika Gupta, and the other staff for hosting us, and of course to Professor Cooperson for being able to join us. This is a wonderful opportunity.
I'd also like to thank the LitFest for this wonderful invitation, and also Kevin for agreeing to be my interlocutor.
Absolutely, we've interlocked before. we've had conversations before about this and other things, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Professor. So just to sort of kick us off, I wanted to ask if you could introduce us to the author of the Impostures, Abul Qasim Al-Ḥarīrī, and the genre of Maqāmāt.
I've always had an affinity with Al-Ḥarīrī because the story is that he actually wasn't very good at writing difficult rhymed prose compositions. And in his difficulty, he would tear at his hair. And the story is that as he was writing, he would tear at his beard with such vehemence that by the time he'd finished the Maqāmāt, he had actually torn it all out. And as you can see, I look as if I've subjected myself to a similar ordeal, and in fact I have. Writing for him wasn't easy. He was actually trying to imitate a predecessor, someone who lived 100 years before, who had pioneered this genre, which is a genre of rhymed prose narrative. It foregrounds the rhyme and the language, and there's generally a trick, a comical trick. A con man hoodwinks the audience or the narrator. And a very famous set of these stories had been written around the year 1000. And 100 years later, our hero, Al-Ḥarīrī, tried to write his own. And it was very difficult for him. In the end, his version of the genre became actually more famous than the first. But at the time he was writing them, he didn't know that. And he suffered terribly.
And so you have joined him in this fellowship of suffering through through the language and through translation.
And there is something, though, to be said for the fact that in this sense, the original is itself a kind of translation. I mean, he was trying to produce something that, in a sense, had already been produced by someone else. So I felt a certain kinship with him.
Absolutely.
In trying to do the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, very well put. Very well put. So I wanted to ask also about Al-Ḥarīrī's life and times and how they contributed, if at all, to how and why he wrote this unique work.
So by the time Ḥarīrī came along, there was already a tradition of Arabic literature that was dense and rich enough that he could fill pages and pages with quotations and reference. I mean, the set of stories, and I should say that his particular set of Maqāmāt, there are 50 stories, and they all are full of allusions and references and quotes and riffs on one or another element of the tradition. So there have been critics who denounce this as being derivative and decadent, and I mean, in the 19th century, it was received, especially in France, by European critics as being decadent, as being an example of Oriental decadence. Despite the fact that it had been very popular, it's probably the most popular work of secular literature in Arabic ever written. Unlike, say, the 1001 Nights, which is very popular in the West, but wasn't in its original culture, the Maqāmāt of Ḥarīrī were actually used as a teaching text. This is how you learn Arabic. And so there's a kind of didacticism to them, and there's a kind of understanding that, we're all educated people here, and we're going to swap these tidbits of recondite information about our language and its traditions. And so it's very much a kind of in-joke. It's one big in-joke in a way that I don't think had quite been done before. It's very self-referential. It's very self-aware. It's a bit laborious, actually, in that sense.
Yeah, a beard-pulling labor, as it were, as you mentioned in the very beginning. And going off of that, I wanted to sort of follow up with that and ask if this aspect of the work or some other contributed to its relative obscurity. You yourself point out in the Impostures that the Maqāmāt genre, as you just said, is central to Arabic literature, but historically has been all but unknown to the West, especially compared to works like 1001 Nights. Why is that?
I think it comes from the in-joke part. I think that you can write 20 pages of grammar jokes and 30 pages of puns in Arabic, and people found it very amusing in the 12th century. But then when you come to put that into another language, the consensus was it couldn't be done, at least among European scholars. Now, what's striking about that is that the Maqāmāt of Ḥarīrī had been translated into Hebrew brilliantly about a century after they were written. So there's a medieval Hebrew translation that's absolutely fantastic. It replicates the rhyme, it replicates the prosometrum, it replicates the puns and the jokes, except that it biblicizes everything, so that it's really renaturalized and reimagined in Hebrew. And it's one of the great monuments of translation. And the very same thing was done in the 19th century in Germany by the Romantic poet Friedrich Nietzsche, who actually did the very same thing. I mean, he replicates the puns and the rhymes. He cheats in that he leaves a few things out. And he took a great deal of liberty with the text, which his contemporaries found to be something that made it something other than a translation. In fact, he himself said it's not a translation. He calls it a Nachbildung, which is a reworking or a recasting, basically. So the irony then is that we have, on the one hand, something that people think can't be translated, and on the other, we have examples of people doing it very successfully. So there was always this odd disconnect. And I think, ultimately, compared to the 1001 Nights, the 1001 Nights are straightforward storytelling. With all due respect for their complexity, but there's a certain kind of just narrative drive that keeps you reading, and that's really how it works. And that's something that I think is universal, or as close to universal as anything is. And so people keep turning the pages. I mean, it's irresistible. Whereas with the Maqāmāt, it really depends on how much of a word fiend you are, how much you really enjoy these obscure tricks with language. And because I should say that the protagonist of these stories is someone who can do miracles with language. I mean, he's a con man, he's a trickster, but his superpower is that he can speak, he can produce a message that reads coherently forwards and backwards. He can produce messages that use only half the letters in the language. He can produce really any kind of discourse that the situation calls for spontaneously. And here, I think Ḥarīrī is just a kind of massive wish fulfillment, because he was no good at this. And so he imagines this hero who can just do it without any effort at all. Except that the guy is a secret drinker and a hypocrite and, all kinds of things. But he's a rogue, he's a trickster. And so there's a certain disreputable quality about it all. Which makes it all the more remarkable that it became a canonical work of fiction for this culture, or a paradigmatic work of narrative for this culture, despite being about basically a drunken hypocrite who produces language that's inimitable, which is practically blasphemous, and yet it somehow found a place. It found a place.
And also became the subject of commentaries and imitations. Is that right? I mean, I'm not familiar with the full volume of how many commentaries, but maybe say one or two things about that.
I do want to say, should any fellow Arabists or people interested in Arabic literature who may be watching at some point, there's the person I would send you to on this on many of these questions is a guy named Matthew Keegan, who is. Of course, you know him. He just finished a fantastic dissertation on the whole tradition of the reception of the Maqāmāt. And one of the things that emerges from it is that, his argument is that the Maqāmāt are essentially an invitation and a kind of boot camp in how to do interpretation, how to interpret difficult texts. And so he's really interested in that back and forth in the commentaries where people are arguing over what the words mean. And it's one of the most touching things about, working with this materials. You look at the manuscripts and you see these people scribbling the words in because they didn't understand them, and, who knows whether these were native speakers or bilingual people at some place along that range of knowing Arabic, not quite knowing it, being native speakers who weren't familiar with the literary tradition, whatever it may be. But there's a lot of anxiety around this book. A lot of this sense that you need to know all these words or something bad will happen. And so there's, it's unreadable without a commentary. And the biggest commentary, the most commonly published one, is written by a guy in Spain. So the other end of the Islamic world. But only 100 years after the original came out. So within 100 years, people on the other side of the world were already writing multi-volume commentaries on the book. So, without the commentaries, I would never have been able to get past the first page of the translation.
Just incredible to see the spread of Arabic across such a huge geographic area and in a relatively coherent tradition, I think. And so on this point of being able to sort of dig into the text, as you say, language is on display in the Impostures to the point where it sort of becomes the star of the show, almost like the main character. The original Arabic is full of riddles and poetry and palindromes, and each maqama furthermore adopts a different register. And so for your translation, you've done something I think fairly unique. I've certainly never heard of anything like this before. Tackling it with 50 Englishes of your own, inspired by Raymond Queneau's exercice de style. And the point of that was to acknowledge that any translation of Al-Ḥarīrī, of such a virtuoso performance, must be a kind of performance itself. So, you know, talk us through a little bit of that process. And, you know, if you feel like holding forth on this, what might you say to skeptics who, on the one hand, prefer a quieter role for the translator, but on the other hand, to those who might think it's sort of an over-domestication to look for rhetorical and cultural equivalencies in the target language?
Right. So it so happens that my translation came out not too long after Emily Wilson's very successful translation of the Odyssey, in which she says that you know, she made a deliberate effort to avoid the kind of highfalutin, overblown epic style that people may associate with Homer. That she strove for simplicity, to let the original speak, and all those great things that you want to do when you start translating something. And very shortly before my translation appeared, an article also appeared by Paul Kroll in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, in which he talks about translations of Chinese poetry that are full of all kinds of nonsense. And he's fantastically eloquent in skewering these you know, what he thinks of as being overwrought and overthought translations. And I had basically at that point already committed myself to doing precisely everything that they say not to do. However, I have two kind of tickets out of jail. One of them is that there already is a literal translation. I mean, in the late 19th century, an Englishman and then a German sort of transplant to England, so Chenery and Steingass, produced basically a literal rendering for students, and they claim they have no pretensions to literary merit. They're trying to help students, because there was this persistent myth that went back 300 years in Europe that somehow the way to learn Arabic is to read these texts, even though they're horrendously difficult. So, I mean, it's like learning English by reading, I don't know, Gertrude Stein or you know, James Thurber or something. I mean, you will learn English, but what you'll learn is going to be quite odd. So there is already a literal translation, so I felt off the hook there. And secondly, I felt that that there were precedents, as I mentioned, in Hebrew and German for naturalizing the text, and that it wasn't worth translating literally again. That if it was going to be done, it would have to be something like what Urquhart had done in German, something like what Habizi had done in Hebrew. And so what I ended up focusing on was how to solve the problem of rhymed prose, because the original rhymes. And English doesn't handle rhymed prose very well. In fact, Gertrude Stein and James Thurber happened to be able to write it fairly well, very well, as a matter of fact. But it's not really sustainable for a whole book, I don't think. In addition to that, I felt that the rhyme prose is critical, but that one needs to find a substitute for it rather than try to do that same thing. So in other words, a simple, application of the principle of transference, right? And if I can't do this here, I'll do it somewhere else. So what does English do? I mean, English exists in all these varieties. So I thought, all right, that'll be my hook. And the reason I think if it worked, the reason I think it may have worked is that it has the idea of constraint, that rhymed prose is a constraint. And we have in Western languages constraint, and that's where the Oulipo comes in. You mentioned Queneau, and these were my inspirations, and Georges Perec, and people who wrote deliberately. Perec wrote a novel without an E, and Queneau writes this exercice book with 99 different styles. And so I thought, all right, that's the way to do it, is to have a constraint. It's not going to be rhyme, it's going to be style. And so each of the 50 is in a different English style, sometimes more than one, either historically or in terms of, there's an author I model myself on, or in terms of global English, different jargons. different creoles, thieves' cant, whatever it may be, different topolects, local languages, in a variety of places. Ultimately, I felt it was necessary to do something, and that something is extravagant and show-offy and loud, and it's really everything that Wilson and Kroll say not to do with very good reason, and I wouldn't do it with any other book but this.
Yeah, I reading through it, one is struck by just the range of Englishes, Englishes that I'd never heard of before in some cases. And one thing I remember reading in maybe a footnote that you include is the desire not to privilege one above the other as a linguist, to sort of approach them all on their own terms, and that adds something to this translation. Whereas, previous translators might have said, well, this doesn't belong in an erudite text or something like that.
Well, I'm glad there were ones that you didn't know. I was hoping that no matter who the reader is, that somebody would, there'd be some that would be familiar and some not so much, right?
Yeah.
So one I did in collaboration with a Nigerian writer, and it's in what they call Niger language, and so it's a kind of originally Portuguese Creole, and then it becomes involved with English, and now it's become a native language for many people. Not to mention that there's a kind of standard Nigerian English and a kind of standard global English that many Nigerians use. But many people have told me that was the hardest one. They had a lot of trouble reading it. But then again, there are like 70 million people in Nigeria for whom English is their first language. So I'm like, all right, let's make sure they have something that they like. And if, lots of other people don't like it, that's too bad, because, it's democracy, right? So, I tried to make sure that everybody was, and there are some now that I look back on, and I wrote those words and I don't remember what they say anymore, because I had to do essentially 50 different kinds of English in succession. So I learned, Hiberno English, and how to imitate Jane Austen, how to imitate Marjorie Kemp, how to imitate Charles Dickens, and so with each iteration, I would sort of cancel the previous one and go on to the next one. But you know what? It's actually an interesting exercise for oneself, for one's students. But to say, write in the style of so and so, what that means simply is, and I'm hoping that there are translators who don't mind getting into the nitty gritty here, because this is what I would want to know if I were hearing a talk like this by someone else. Exactly how do you do that? And the answer is, there are places online like Gutenberg that have full texts of Shakespeare, Twain, Austen, anyone you can think of, dutifully typed in by these wonderful people who make the text available. And it's very easy to do a search and find out, do they use a certain word? And I wanted to use, for example, in one it's written in the style of Jane Austen, I wanted to use the word trencher, which is a kind of wooden dish, right? It turns out she doesn't use it. She doesn't say trencher anywhere. So I really wrestled with that one, and finally I broke down, and I occasionally would let myself, break the rule, and I found that, well, it's attested in the OED to her time, so I decided to let it go. But other than that, the principle was that if I'm imitating, Kevin Blankinship, I have your complete works. I'm only allowed to use the words that you use. Okay, so if you have never used the word trencher, then I really can't use it, no matter how much I want to. And when you start doing that, after a while, funny things happen to your brain. But it's really just a matter of, as one of the reviewers put it, diligence rather than genius.
That's great. It's so funny. Speaking of this linguistic performance, I wanted to ask you about theatricality, which we talked about before. The title itself is Impostures, which sort of gives away the importance of performance or theatricality in these texts. And you've even rendered a few of them as plays or musicals. Number 9 is a Gilbert and Sullivan parody. Number 13 is modeled after Merry Wives of Windsor. Number 24 is inspired by Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. So, why is performativity important, if it is, to these works? And also, do you think that they would work as actual stage productions if you were to be the director of such a stage play?
You know, I know some very talented actors and directors and writers, and I think that no doubt they would find a way to make this work. Although I think they would probably have to transform it in the same way that I tried to transform the original. So I think it would be several steps away from the original, because one of the things our friend Morris Pomerantz pointed this out to me, how many of the gags really depend on the visual. How many things are just really depend on funny things he does with letters. So when he has a sermon where Abū Zayd, the hero, produces a sermon that uses only dotted letters or only undotted letters, you actually can't tell that that's what's happening, right, unless you have it in front of you, and even then you might not notice. Until someone in the audience, in the story says, "Hey, there's no dots in that," whatever. And so I think a lot of it is visual. And of course, a talented playwright would find some way to substitute for that. I think that the stories, I think Ḥarīrī probably didn't intend to write clever short stories. He wasn't trying to be Saki or Damon Runyon or somebody. He wasn't trying to be that, but I think in a few cases his cleverness kind of got the better of him, and he actually did write some extremely good con man stories. So there are maybe 3 or 4, I think, where actually the reader is fooled. There actually is a con that's carried out that actually works, I think, dramatically. So sure, I think it could be done. I think it would take somebody who has a talent for that kind of thing, an inclination for it. Whether it could be done in English with my text, I don't know. I think probably it should be done in Arabic first, just because it deserves it. I mean, that's the original. It really deserves that more than my translation does. But there are limitations. I mean, there are 50 stories. 4 of them have a female character. 5 of them have a female character who's prominent. Other than that, though, it feels very male. I mean, there's a lot of things about it that, it doesn't, people talk about it as being a mirror of society at the time. I'm not sure that's quite true. I mean, we don't see that many different kinds of people, really. So, it just would depend on how people felt about, you might want to tweak the gender a little bit. I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, one of the stories has Abū Zayd as a woman. I think that there's important, maybe sociological information in there about male bonding, or what Shaka Turaba calls, homosociality rather than homosexuality, but this homosocial world of medieval learning and all of that. I think that a good director could bring that out. But we're in a time, I think, when, well, here we are, 2 guys talking, but, I think it would need to be a bit more, I think that a modern version would have to maybe dwell more on the other kinds of characters, maybe because there are enslaved figures as well. There are children. And I think, I think a modern production might want to try to bring out more of those multiple voices, and maybe even the kind of slightly deranged element to it too. I mean, you have a narrator and a main character who arguably are actually the same person, and they're suffering some kind of schizoid personality disorder. I mean, there's too many things they have in common for it to be coincidence. So I think that there are things that one could do that would be very clever, but that falls to others.
Right. And as you said too, it would take a bit of acrobatics to be able to do that. I'm reminded here of Aisha Abdurrahman bint Shalti, who conceived of the Epistle of Forgiveness by Al-Ḥarīrī, another writer who I think shares a kinship with Al-Ḥarīrī in terms of sort of these verbal pyrotechnics. Trying to make that, it's a journey through heaven and hell, trying to make that into a play. I really don't know if it would work as it was originally written, just because there's so many asides, on grammar and prosody and language and things like that. And so much of it, like you said, is even visual, but beyond that, just these sort of in-joke erudite references that, it would take some real recasting to put it into a stage production. Yeah, that's right. This seems like a good place to ask about sort of social critique, or sort of, like you said, the mirror of society thing, question. I read the Impostures, and there are episodes which poke fun at judges. I think it's number, let's see, There is number 20. Let's see. Sorry for the delay. Hopefully we can edit out this this pause. Number 10, which is Chaucerian English, features a judge who has a weakness for young flesh. Number 22, leveraging the flow, which was one of my favorites, by the way. You know, it mocks petty bureaucrats with a debate between chancery scribes and court accountants, and you have it in middle management speak, which I thought was a brilliant, a very inspired choice of English. You know, so if not, at least in part, some kind of social critique, how do you see sort of the function of these jaundiced portraits that we see of different types, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that Ḥarīrī is concerned with issues beyond language, or I think language is for him the way he thinks about these issues, and I think for him the problem really is that that Arabic retains a kind of residual holiness or numinousness that is the relic of having been used by God to pronounce the revelation, and people can tap into that in order to perform these kinds of impossible verbal feats. And there's something disturbing for him about that, and there's something curious about it. I think, you know, I don't mean to Christianize it necessarily, but I think we're seeing a struggle with this question of about, you know, is God the Word? I mean, is the Word God? And I think that what he's struggling with is that language can make us think that that's true, that somehow finding a word, finding the right word, will lead to insight into spiritual matters. And what seems to happen in this story is that that doesn't work. That the narrator is never moved by these wonderful sermons. I mean, he's never moved to contrition. I mean, that's the point of the sermons, right? Abū Zayd gives a sermon, people weep, they give him money, and he goes and spends it in tavern. And even before the narrator knows that that's what's going to happen, he's still not moved by the sermon. He only appreciates it as a verbal performance, but he's never religiously affected by it. And neither is the person who produces them. I mean, Abū Zayd himself is not, until the last episode. And then there's a great debate among critics. This is the one where Abū Zayd supposedly becomes a Sufi mystic and all of that. You know, I think that Al-Ḥarīrī was struggling with this. I think he felt that there was a kind of odd failure to match up between language and emotion and the spiritual. And I don't think that for him society was necessarily much of a concern. I think when he depicts people, you know, Abū Zayd being greedy and so on, I don't think that he's actually satirizing society, because to me what that requires is that you feel a kind of you feel a dissatisfaction about the fact that society you happen to live in isn't as good as the one you can imagine, and isn't even as good as the one that everybody has already agreed would be better. Yeah. And I don't sense that with him. I sense that he feels that we are all in a fallen state. We are all in a post-lapsarian world where language seems magical but isn't. And I think that's what's bugging him. I don't really see him as, you know, I think there's one on slavery, and I drew on the language of Frederick Douglass to make him sound like an abolitionist, because there is a really fantastic expression of the indignity of slavery in that particular Maqāmāt. So I shamelessly, you know, milked it to give it that resonance for something that remains a live issue, and where Ḥarīrī probably accidentally just sounds really modern when he denounces it. So it's not that there aren't moments of wonderfully expressed indignation about the state of the world, right? But I just don't see it in that utopian critical tradition that comes out of the French Revolution and then Dickens and all. I just don't, it doesn't feel to me that we're dealing with someone who thinks that you can make this world a better place. It just doesn't have that feeling to me. But you know, if you felt that way, that's great, because what it affirms for us is that it's a polyvalent text that accommodates many readings, and that's exactly what Ḥarīrī wanted, and that's exactly what I want. So great. I mean, if someone sees it there, then I'm happy. I mean, that's good. I don't object to someone arguing. I just didn't feel it myself.
Right. Well, and we can talk also about a generic dominant too. So the dominant might be, you know, we're playing with language, we're telling these inside jokes, and there might be strains of other things there too, obviously, to make it, you know, relevant to society and to play off of types and characters. Speaking of types and characters, one thing you mentioned was the relationship between the protagonist, Abū Zayd, and the perhaps overly credulous narrator, Al-Ḥarīrī. And in your translation, this relationship sends up some of the richest echoes, where it links them to similar literary pairings. So we have Dr. Johnson and Boswell, Jekyll and Hyde, Piers Plowman and the Virtues. So, you know, talk a little bit about the nature of this relationship. How much does it help us understand the text? How much does it prevent us from understanding the text? And can we trust either of these men?
One of my favorite critics is Daniel Beaumont, who's written that we need to avoid thinking of Al-Ḥarīrī and Abū Zayd, so the narrator and the protagonist, as characters, and certainly not as people. He thinks that he calls them the materialization of a function, which sounds very clinical, but I think that essentially, I mean, one could think of Abū Zayd as being language. I mean, he's polyvalent, he's multiple, he's plural, he's constantly, he's able to imitate anyone. And so there's this kind of there's this plurality that he is, essentially, that makes him really not human anymore, I don't think. So then it becomes irrelevant, in a sense, whether you believe him or not. I mean, he's just kind of, he's a protean natural force. And there is something slightly terrifying. I think Stephen Greenblatt put it very well when he talks about, you know, there is something paradoxically inhuman about language. I mean, there's something terrifyingly inhuman about it, actually, because it transcends and will outlive all of us. You know, it's almost like this kind of parasite that we carry our whole lives long, and we know that we may be able to tweak in one direction or another before we give it to others. But there is something kind of, it almost consumes us, you know, and so on. And so I think that, you know, the real struggle is with language, and whether it's real, whether it corresponds to any kind of real feeling or not. And I think that, yeah, looking at these other pairings helps to bring out some of that. I mean, Johnson is eloquent and brilliant and clever, but he's also cruel and demeaning to Boswell, you know. And Boswell himself was no slacker as a writer. He's quite good.
Yeah, that's right.
And you wonder how much of Johnson's eloquence is actually the product of, you know, poor Boswell sitting there and, you know, tweaking all the sentences. So I think that's very much a part of it. And so I didn't, you know, I don't think I've written on anything about that. I hope someone does. But yeah, there's the Boswell, Johnson, there's Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, very much the same dynamic, I think, in some ways. We're, you know, and Toklas was a good writer too. You know, she just, you know, got famous because she was the diarist, essentially, of Stein. So I mean, there are many of these pairings, and I think it's a really rich, because I think it's a way of saying that, you know, it may take more than one. I mean, you know, language requires an audience. It requires two people, right? Someone has to speak, someone has to listen. There has to be a dialogue or interlocutor or whatever. So, you know, I think that there's a real insight there that you've proposed.
Yeah, I as I listened to you talk, you mentioned that these are otherworldly, you know, inhuman kind of functions in the text, and yet they're not sort of allegorical virtues in the same way that you might have in like a passion play or Dante's Commedia, something to be, you know, something to be followed, you know, again, a virtue to be that's embodied in a figure that we should then emulate somehow, that interacts with other virtues, something else even than that, it seems.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way, but certainly I think there's not any clear moral to be learned from the story. I mean, there's certainly no there's a rather terrifying absence of morality, and I think a kind of melancholy, a kind of sadness that, because there is something. I mean, if I can lapse into awful generalization, but I think there is something. It's what Hodgson called the challenge of Islam. There's a kind of hopefulness that people are not born into sin. People are not born into sin, and the point of having a law is that you can make the world a better place. It isn't just about the hereafter, right? The point is that God gave us a law now so that we can improve the world that we live in now. So there's a essential optimism to the message, right? If one abstracts it that way. And I think one of the things that we see coming through very much with Ḥarīrī is that he certainly, and no doubt many of his contemporaries, had lost that feeling that things could be made better now. Or that, that somehow we failed to, as Hodgson would say, we haven't responded appropriately to that challenge. That God gave us this revelation and this language and this community and this law, and we haven't lived up to that expectation. So there is a kind of melancholy to it. That may just be a product of, he may have felt that way. It may be something about the zeitgeist. There are all kinds of things one can bring in, but it's a funny book. It's a raunchy book, but it's also a sad book. I mean, there is a lot of just shabbiness that he dwells on, and a lot of cruelty, and a lot of sorrow in one way or another. And he's a refugee. I mean, that's another way in which it speaks to our time. Abū Zayd is a refugee, and he's lost his home to the Crusaders or the Byzantines, depending on whom you ask. And so there is that this expulsion from paradise subtext throughout it. That somehow, all of us are living in some post-Lapsarian world that doesn't quite live up to our expectations, and all we have left, I mean, the one apple that you plucked from the tree of knowledge that you get to keep when you get thrown out is language. I mean, that's all you've got left, is that thing that reminds you that you were great once. So I think it can go either way. I don't think he's consciously playing on these ideas as an allegory, but I think that they're hard not to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put.
So Kevin, you very kindly asked me to read a brief selection, and I will do that, and you'll be able to see what it is that I'm reading. And the reason that that's important is that this particular text is a letter that Abū Zayd, the protagonist, is supposed to have written, where he does something extremely difficult, which is he uses an alternation of dotted and undotted letters in Arabic. So about half the letters have dots on them and half don't. And he makes sure that if he uses a dotted letter, the next one must be undotted, and so on throughout the message. So it's an extreme constraint. So what I discovered was that there's something similarly extreme in the Ulipo tradition, which is where something called the prisoner's constraint, where you cannot use any letters that go above or below the line. So I translated the epistle using that constraint. So I'll read just a bit of the Arabic so you can hear the rhyme. You obviously won't be able to hear the dots being there, but you'll be able to see it. So just a brief bit from that passage. مناظم شرفه تأتلف والشؤوب حبائه يكف ونائل يديه فاض وشح قلبه غاض وخلف سخائه يحتلب وذهب عيابه يحترب. That gives you a sense of the rhythm and the rhyme. So in English, as you'll see, there are no letters that go above or below the line. And here's just a bit of the translation. Criers across Eurasia announce in unison, our emir is our resource, our reservoir, our Eozoic reign, our successor, sorrow's ransom, care's surcease. In crisis, no one unnerves. In races, no one overcomes our man. Successors, none can vie. Even enemies are won over en masse. Encomiums accrue. An horizon, viva rex. Remain a moon, never wane. Revive us now, monsoon rain. Mercies wax numerous, messianic rumors increase. I, sir, serve our emir. Now I crave a savior. Careworn, I ooze miseries. In woe I am Cain. Even so I survive as some Asian Romanov. In verse, moreover, I mesmerize. In sermons, I overawe Cicero. In missives, I summon snow in winter, or mimic in mosaic zinnias and roses. Even so I save, I conserve, I economize. I consume no sauce, no caviar, no sesame. A carer's coin snares me acorns, or on occasion marrows. Muses averse, career in ruins, I am moreover in arrears. A usurer, a ravenous monomaniac vexes me. So review, sir, our case, ransom me or issue me a sinecure, and so remain in verse a Maecenas as we mere men revere an ever-wise Newman. Amen.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I have time for one more question, I think, or we have time for one more question to discuss. And it's something, I've wondered about as I, read and wrote about the translation and the text itself, which is, what audience did you and do you envision for a text like this? And you spoke a little bit about this, 70 million Nigerians, hopefully, some of them can pick this up and enjoy at least one or two of the episodes. This is not a, it's a unique work for sure. And, again, your translation is part of that as well. So who do you envision being able to pick this up and enjoy it, or at least, struggle with it a little bit to the point where they stick with it?
I've been amazed at the kinds of responses that I've gotten. I mean, people that I haven't met people who, this is their first experience reading anything like this. I mean, mostly it's people who are either interested in translation or interested in Arabic or whatever it might be. So in that sense, it hasn't been a surprise. But then, I've heard from several people that they actually read one every night. A friend says, my wife and I read them every night before we go to bed or something. We read one a night. And I've had people sing them. I've had there was somebody who put up on Twitter, his own reading of one that was a 17th century, and he did the accent perfectly, and he just, recorded that. I've just had all kinds of people responding to it in different creative ways. So in that sense, I've been happy, and I haven't really envisioned an audience in particular. So I mean, partly it's you. It's people who know Arabic and can appreciate what's happened to the original, but also care about English and care about writing. And so the fact that people like yourself have taken this much time to think about it is really a source of endless gratification to me, because I just, if you didn't hate it, then my job is done, right? If you didn't sit here for half an hour and tell me what a miserable book it was, then something has been accomplished. So I didn't have anyone particular in mind, but each particular person who claims to have read it and has read it it's always a nice surprise.
I certainly did not hate it. Bilaks, it's in fact the opposite. I certainly appreciated it and the work you did, and I think it's testament to the text itself, and also to your energy and others who have received it, that it continues to be relevant, despite sort of this despair over that you expressed before, and this melancholy. The challenge remains, and for each generation to pick it up again. So I think we can close there with a very fruitful discussion. Thank you, Professor Cooperson, for making time to be with us. And thanks again to the Jaipur Literature Festival for having us on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you as well.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kevin, for that wonderful session. Thank you for taking us through such a beautiful journey. If you all enjoyed the session, please do share with your friends and family and on your social media pages. Thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. We promise to be back next week with another exciting session of Words Are Bridges. Have a good evening.